In 2020, a viral video showed Amy Cooper calling 911 from Central Park, claiming that a black man was threatening her life. That man, Christian Cooper, had done nothing more than politely ask her to leash her dog, just as the park rules required. The video was infuriating, but not surprising. Author and activist Padma Lakshmi responded on Twitter, writing, "You are indeed racist if you've ever tried to call 911 because a black person asked you to leash your dog. A black person was having a barbecue. Black children were selling lemonade. Or a group of black people were using the same gym as you." Because this was social media, the conversation didn't end there. But one of her follow-up tweets really stuck with me. She wrote, "Racism is a spectrum with varying degrees of unconscious and learned behaviors reinforced by society every day." It's not unlike the point made in the satirical musical Avenue Q, with its song, "Everyone's a Little Bit Racist." That show, an adult take on Sesame Street, is cheeky, provocative, and often uncomfortable. In this particular song, the characters living on Avenue Q try to make the case that we all carry racial biases, whether we acknowledge them or not. Writer Annie Bocock, reflecting on the song for Onstage blog, said she had mixed feelings about it. The song, she notes, is trying to say that unconscious bias is real, and if we can admit that, maybe we can start to take responsibility for how we're complicit in systemic racism. She writes, "Racism lies on a spectrum, and the song does a great job displaying this, even if it's outdated. And yeah, it's outdated in places. One line goes, 'Ethnic jokes might be uncouth, but you laugh because they're based on truth.' That line gets us something deeper, something dangerous, because truth is a loaded word, especially when it comes to race. Many of the so-called truths behind racial jokes are actually stereotypes, ones that throughout American history have justified discrimination, violence, even murder. The real danger comes when we lose the ability to tell the difference between stereotypes and truth, perception and reality, and bias and belief." Take Dr. Seuss, for instance. There's a lesser-known book called Dr. Seuss Goes to War, which showcases 200 of his editorial cartoons from World War II. The war against Germany felt deeply personal for Theodore Seuss Geisel, a third-generation American whose 4 grandparents had all been born in Germany. He'd even traveled to the land of his ancestors during the interwar years. While there, he quickly came to despise fascism, and especially its virulent anti-Semitism. Eventually, the US Air Force hired him to create propaganda targeting isolationists, particularly those in the America First movement, who were known for their racist and anti-interventionist views. Based on those wartime cartoons, it's clear that Dr. Seuss understood racism and the damage it could do. But as you turn the pages, something troubling happens. His illustrations slide off the anti-racist spectrum when it comes to Japan, and to some degree even China, despite them being America's allies during the war. The Japanese-American National Museum weighed in after the Seuss estate pulled 6 of its books from publication, titles that included racist caricatures of Asian people. Their president, Ann Burroughs, called the move necessary and overdue, stating, "The mainstreaming of racism and prejudice is deeply embedded in our culture. It is high time that Dr. Seuss's work is examined. The light of history could not have provided more compelling evidence." And she's right. By today's standards, some of Dr. Seuss's work simply doesn't hold up. But it's also true that during the war, no American cartoonist was portraying Japanese people, either overseas or at home, in a positive light. That's not surprising in the context of Pearl Harbor and a country that largely tolerated the forced relocation and imprisonment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans in American concentration camps. What is surprising is that a man who clearly recognized the dangers of anti-Semitism and European fascism, a man who used his pen to fight white supremacy in one arena, was simultaneously promoting racist depictions of people from the largest continent on Earth. The Asia-Pacific Journal summed it up best, asking, how could a man as forward-looking as Dr. Seuss have these feet of clay? And they weren't wrong to call him forward-looking. During the war, Seuss tackled anti-black racism. After the war, he explored themes like environmentalism in the Lorax, the Cold War in the Butter Battle book, consumerism in How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and childhood literacy in The Cat and the Hat. Even Horton Hears a Who, if you dig into it, works as an allegory for post-war US occupation of Japan, and offers far more sympathy than his earlier work ever did. So how do we reconcile this? A man who fought racism on one front while spreading it on another. President Barack Obama helps us make sense of it, stating that racial advancement doesn't proceed in a straightforward moving line. Instead, moments of progress give way to regressions. That push and pull, progress and backlash is baked into American history. And nowhere is that cycle more visible than in America's relationship with Chinese migrants. It was a past so deeply stained with anti-Asian racism that even someone like Dr. Seuss, who stood against hate in other forms, might have absorbed those biases without fully realizing it, fighting racism while unknowingly spreading it. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon America's dark history of xenophobia. Episode number 2, The China Virus. First, let me point out that I recognize the politically charged term used for the title of this episode. Although this episode will focus primarily on America's relationship with Chinese immigrants during the late 19th century, I'll also touch on the false racist claim pushed by a number of prominent Americans that COVID was purposefully released by China. But instead of just rehashing that debate, I want to use the phrase for what it reveals: how fear itself can spread like a contagion. The term China virus captures perfectly the kind of xenophobia that once raged across the United States, from the West Coast all the way to regions that had never seen a single Chinese migrant, but were somehow convinced that they should fear them. So let's begin with why the Chinese began to arrive on American shores in large numbers. Like every migration story, it starts with a pair of forces: push and pull. Mid-19th century China, especially in the southern provinces, was a place of turmoil. Famine, floods, political collapse, the Opium Wars had battered the economy, and the Qing dynasty's already fragile control was slipping fast. It's worth noting that list includes both natural and man-made disasters, some of them caused directly or indirectly by foreign powers like Britain and, yes, the United States. In other words, America helped create the very conditions that would later bring Chinese migrants to its shores, the same migrants it would soon condemn. With China in tatters, it's no wonder people started looking eastward across the Pacific. When you've lost nearly everything, the idea of starting over, even halfway around the world, stops being a dream. It becomes survival. And the lure of America? Gold. Or at least the myth of easy gold. The Gold Mountain, as California was called in China, shimmered in their imagination. A place where fortune could be plucked straight from the riverbeds. The gold rush of 1849 became more than a rumor. It was a promise, one powerful enough to send thousands across the ocean, chasing opportunity and a chance to rewrite their futures. And come they did. By 1852, more than 20,000 Chinese immigrants had arrived in California, most entering through the port of San Francisco. Some went straight to the gold fields, others found work in restaurants, domestic service, or, perhaps most iconically, laundries. Any job that offered a foothold in the American economy was fair game, no matter how grueling or low-paying. Let's pause for a moment on that line from Avenue Q. Ethnic jokes might be uncouth, but you laugh because they're based on truth. It's an uncomfortable idea, but it hints at something worth unpacking, namely how immigrant groups become tied, often unfairly, to certain kinds of work. For Chinese migrants, that association was the laundromat, not because of any cultural tradition or special skill, but because racism and exclusion left them few other options. Laundry was brutally hard work. In the 19th century, it meant hauling and heating water over open fire, scrubbing garments by hand, wringing them out, drying them, and pressing each one with heavy, scorching irons. It was hot, endless, and back-breaking, work usually assigned to women, servants, or wives. But on the West Coast, there was a shortage of women and an even greater shortage of people willing to do that kind of labor. So Chinese immigrants filled the gap. Shut out of many other professions by language barriers, racist labor laws, and open hostility, they took what was available to them. Laundry offered a small measure of independence. You could start with little capital, about $500 according to the Association of Chinese Americans for Social Justice. And you didn't need to speak fluent English. Some ran laundries out of storefronts, rented rooms, or even their own houses. But that independence came at a cost. Laundry meant 10 to 16-hour days, 7 days a week, often in suffocating heat and steam, standing barefoot on slippery floors, hauling irons that weighed as much as bricks. Wages hovered around $25 a month. Many workers developed chronic pain, varicose veins, and exhaustion that lasted a lifetime. Still, for most, it was survival, and a way to claim dignity in a country that denied them nearly everything else. And laundry wasn't just physical labor. It became a racial and political target. As Chinese-owned laundries multiplied, they drew fire from white labor unions, city officials, and nativist politicians. Cities passed safety and zoning laws aimed squarely at shutting them down. The message was unmistakable. Chinese immigrants were tolerated only at the margins, and even there, barely. So when we think of the image of the Chinese laundromat, it's not just a quaint cultural stereotype. It's the story of economic resilience born out of exclusion, a people who took the work no one wanted and turned it into their method of survival. But perhaps the most visible and consequential Chinese labor force was the one that helped build America's great national project, the Transcontinental Railroad. Picture it, mid-19th century America, booming but disconnected. The gold rush had flooded California with settlers, but getting there from the east was still a nightmare. You could sail for months around South America, risking storms and disease. Or you could cross overland through deserts, rivers, and mountains, breaking wagons by the dozen. The dream of a transcontinental railroad promised to change all of that. It wasn't just a transportation project, it was a symbol of unity, of expansion, of manifest destiny. In 1862, with the Civil War raging and Southern opposition gone, Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act, granting massive land subsidies and government loans to two private companies, the Union Pacific, which built west from Nebraska, and the Central Pacific, which built east from California. But laying track across an entire continent wasn't just ambitious, it was brutal. Blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, scorching heat in the Utah desert, rock slides, dynamite blasts, and deadly disease. And someone had to do the work. That someone in California turned out to be thousands of Chinese laborers. At first, Central Pacific executives resisted hiring them. assuming the Chinese were too frail, too foreign, too different. But when white workers abandoned the job for saloons, mines, or better pay elsewhere, the company turned to the Chinese out of desperation and was astonished by the results. The Chinese crews didn't just match their white counterparts, they outperformed them. They worked longer hours, kept healthier diets, rarely drank on the job, and seldom struck for pay. They carved tunnels through solid granite, built trestle bridges at dizzying heights, and laid track across some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America, all for a fraction of the wages. By 1863, about 90% of the Central Pacific's entire workforce, over 10,000 men, were Chinese. The railroad was completed in 1869 at Promontory Summit, Utah, where the ceremonial Golden Spike joined the tracks from east and west. The continent was connected. The nation symbolically was whole. But in the famous photograph of that moment, the one every school child sees in their history books, not a single Chinese worker appears. They were written out of the story almost as soon as they'd built it. As the need for cheap labor declined, so did tolerance for the Chinese workers who had built so much of the American West. Once the economy soured in the 1870s and a deep recession took hold, Chinese immigrants, many of whom had been celebrated just years earlier for their endurance and skill, became easy scapegoats. They were accused of stealing jobs, undercutting wages, refusing to assimilate, and perhaps most ironically, of being un-American, despite literally helping to build the physical infrastructure of the nation's future. Historian Erica Lee writes that figures like Dennis Kearney, head of California's Working Man's Party, and notably an Irish immigrant himself, seized on this moment of economic anxiety. He and others stoked fear and resentment, blaming Chinese laborers for job scarcity and stagnating wages. Labor leaders joined in. They claimed that the Chinese were imported slaves, coolies they called them, locked in a system of cheap labor that degraded American workers. Samuel Gompers, the influential president of the American Federation of Labor, went so far as to frame the issue as an existential threat. He asked, "Meat versus rice, American manhood versus Asiatic coolieism, which shall survive?" The rhetoric was vicious, and it was popular. Anti-Chinese sentiment wasn't just found in speeches and protests. It became a staple of the press. One of the loudest voices belonged to the San Francisco Illustrated Wasp, a magazine that gained notoriety for producing the first mass-circulated large-scale color cartoons in the United States. Its name, WASP, stood for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, a cultural identity long associated with racial superiority and nativism. It was a favorite among groups like the Ku Klux Klan and a key voice in spreading white supremacist ideology along the West Coast. And its images? They were disgusting. One particularly infamous cartoon mimics the Statue of Liberty, but with a disturbing twist. Instead of Lady Liberty, the figure is a Chinese man dressed in tattered rags, holding an opium pipe aloft like a torch, and wearing a long braided queue. The symbolism is unmistakable. Liberty has been replaced with vice and foreignness. Another cartoon titled San Francisco's Three Graces shows ghostly figures hovering over ships in the harbor. Each is labeled with a disease: malaria, smallpox, and leprosy, reflecting the belief that immigrants, particularly the Chinese, were carriers of sickness due to their unclean living conditions. And in The Coming Man, the Chinese figure is rendered troll-like, grotesquely exaggerated and looming over a cityscape. It places a heavy hand labeled Monopoly across factories, laundries, import businesses, and the rest of San Francisco's commercial core. suggesting Chinese dominance over the city's economy. These cartoons weren't just images, they were propaganda, and they played a powerful role in shaping public opinion, reinforcing fears, and laying the groundwork for some of the most restrictive immigration policies in American history. The California Supreme Court set an early tone, ruling that Chinese immigrants could not testify in cases involving white defendants. The justification? The court described Chinese people as a distinct race whom nature has marked as inferior. That ruling sent a clear message. Chinese immigrants were not just unwelcome, they were to be stripped of basic legal protections. Other laws followed, less dramatic perhaps, but no less calculated. Taken together, they amounted to a campaign of constant grinding hostility. Take the foreign miners' license tax, for instance. It disproportionately targeted Chinese miners, generating millions of dollars for the state at their expense. Then there was the Q Ordinance, which targeted Chinese cultural identity more directly. The ordinance required that all prisoners in San Francisco jails have their hair cut, specifically their Q, the long braided ponytail traditionally worn by Chinese men under Qing Dynasty law. This wasn't about sanitation or discipline, it was humiliation by design. By 1875, things escalated further with the passage of the Page Act. On paper, it aimed to restrict the immigration of undesirable individuals, including convicts and prostitutes. But in practice, it was used to block nearly every Chinese woman from entering the United States. The result? It tore apart families and ensured that the Chinese immigrant population remained overwhelmingly male, further feeding stereotypes and limiting long-term community development. What started in California soon spread nationally. In the 1876 presidential election, Chinese immigration became a hot-button issue. For the first time since joining the nation, California became a true swing state. Both candidates, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden, raced to prove who could be tougher on Chinese immigration. Ironically, the election itself was ultimately decided by a political bargain that had nothing to do with immigration. The Compromise of 1877 handed Hayes the presidency in exchange for ending Reconstruction in the South. So in a strange and tragic twist, an anti-Chinese backlash helped usher in the era of Jim Crow segregation, linking two of America's darkest racial histories through a single political deal. But things didn't stop there. In 1882, a full 4 years later, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal law to ban immigration based solely on race and nationality. And to sell it to the public, politicians and newspapers reached for a familiar word: invasion. The language was no accident. Invasion stirs fear. It conjures up war, enemies at the gate, a nation under siege. The term has a long history of being used to dehumanize immigrants, then and now. In fact, in 2023, more than 160 civil rights, faith-based, and social justice organizations signed a joint letter urging Congress to stop using the word altogether. They warned that it fuels white nationalist conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement theory and contributes directly to xenophobic violence. And here's the thing: U.S. immigration law already uses loaded language. Migrants aren't just called foreigners, they're labeled aliens. Combine that with talk of an invasion, and the narrative starts to sound less like immigration and more like War of the Worlds. Back in 1882, California Senator John Miller introduced the Chinese Exclusion Act to Congress. In his pitch, he described the Chinese presence as a naval invasion, a direct threat to national security. He insulted Chinese immigrants as weak and incapable of participating in American society. And then, in the very same speech, he contradicted himself, warning that these supposedly inferior people had muscles of iron, and a machine-like efficiency that let them outcompete white workers in nearly every industry. It's a rhetorical bait and switch we've seen many times since. Dehumanize the immigrant, then demonize their work ethic. And it worked. The Chinese Exclusion Act passed easily and stayed on the books for more than 60 years. Lee calls it one of the most important turning points in America's long history of xenophobia. First, it established the United States' sovereign right to regulate foreigners into and within the nation and legalized the restriction, exclusion, and deportation of immigrants considered to be threats to the United States. In 1889, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and more broadly, the right of the United States to exclude foreign immigrants, stating that the power to exclude foreigners was one of the sovereign rights of the U.S. government as delegated by the Constitution. This right also included barring returning American residents of Chinese descent who had previously been legally admitted in order to protect U.S. peace and security. In doing so, Chinese exclusion set in motion the transformation of the United States into a gatekeeping nation, one that began using federal immigration laws to exclude, restrict, and control allegedly dangerous foreigners, often on the basis of race, national origin, ethnicity, class, and sexuality. In the 1880s, the United States was the first gatekeeping nation. Today, of course, every nation is. It also established Chinese immigrants as the ultimate example of the dangerous, degraded alien. No other group had been officially singled out for immigration exclusion or banned from naturalized citizenship based on their race and national origin before. Moreover, the only other immigrants to be similarly banned from the country in 1882 were convicts, lunatics, idiots, or any people considered to be public charges. By using a hatchet instead of a scalpel, the U.S. government didn't just shut the door on future Chinese immigration. It painted an entire race as a threat to the nation. Supporters of the Chinese Exclusion Act were satisfied to see the borders close, but that didn't answer the next pressing question. What about the Chinese immigrants who were already here? Those who had arrived legally, built businesses, raised families, and quite literally laid the tracks for the country's expansion. Their fate was chilling. What followed in the years after 1882 wasn't just exclusion, it was removal. Harassment turned into mob violence. Bureaucratic discrimination that evolved into legal strategies for erasing them. The Chinese Exclusion Act didn't just halt immigration, it introduced something new, the category of the illegal immigrant. Before its passage, simply being in the United States without documentation wasn't a federal crime. But with exclusion came enforcement, and with enforcement came deportation. This is how the United States built its first federal deportation system. And one of the clearest, most violent examples of this climate took place in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in Tacoma, Washington. Now you might imagine this was a place overwhelmed by Chinese migration, but in 1870 there were only around 234 Chinese residents in the entire Washington territory, just 1% of the population. They weren't overrunning anything. They weren't even big enough to be considered a voting bloc, and yet they were seen as a threat. Even before exclusion became national policy, Chinese residents in Washington territory had been banned from voting as early as 1853. In 1863, they were stripped of the right to testify in court cases involving white citizens. A year later, a targeted poll tax was enacted, officially titled an Act to Protect Free White Labor Against Competition with Chinese Coolie Labor and to Discourage the Immigration of Chinese in the Territory. The message couldn't be clearer. By the 1880s, a national economic depression was squeezing out white workers. Unemployment was high, and frustration needed a target. Enter the Knights of Labor, one of the largest labor organizations of the time. While often credited for cross-class organizing, the Knights also carried a strong streak of nativism, and Chinese workers were high on their list of perceived threats. In Tacoma, they joined forces with another group, the Liberal League, a so-called civic organization steeped in white supremacist ideology. Together, they schemed to create what would come to be known as the Tacoma Method. On November 3, 1885, a mob of more than 500 white residents, led by the mayor, city councilmen, and business leaders, marched through the city. They went door to door, evicting nearly every Chinese resident. Families were dragged into the streets, given only hours to pack what they could carry. Homes were looted, businesses destroyed. The city's Chinese district was set on fire. This wasn't a spontaneous riot. It was coordinated. It was public. It was civic terrorism. The website The Tacoma Method tells us that newspapers across the country had mixed reactions. In cities like San Francisco, where anti-Chinese sentiment was strong, the expulsion was celebrated. The Overland Monthly praised the mob and proudly coined the term the Tacoma Method. The San Francisco Bulletin used the event as a warning to Chinese residents in nearby Santa Cruz. Other papers like the Philadelphia Inquirer and New Haven Register downplayed the violence itself and focused instead on how it might affect broader communities. But some newsrooms did take a stand. On the East Coast, major publications like the New York Times, New York Herald, New York Sun, and New York Tribune all condemned the actions in Tacoma. They cited official reports of abuse and criticized the federal government for its inaction. Historian Erica Lee reminds us that the Exclusion Act was only one part of a much larger campaign. Across the West Coast, cities and states passed laws restricting Chinese workers from jobs, neighborhoods, and even basic civil rights. The message in Tacoma was crystal clear. Even if you're here legally, even if you followed every law, we still don't want you. And Tacoma wasn't alone. The violence spread. Chinese communities were expelled from Seattle, Rock Springs, Wyoming, Denver, Los Angeles, and more. In nearly every case, white residents, frustrated by economic hardship and whipped into fear by racial propaganda, took direct action to erase Chinese neighborhoods. And the federal government? It mostly looked the other way. Yes, the law made a half-hearted attempt at justice. According to the Tacoma Method website, just days after the expulsion, the town threw a celebration. On November 7th, a local organization held a ball in honor of Mayor Jacob Waschbach and the Committee of 15, many of whom had helped lead the mob. But that same day, 27 men, including the mayor, were indicted for their actions. They were arrested on November 9th and taken by train to Vancouver, Washington Territory, for prosecution. Instead of being ashamed, the residents of Tacoma cheered as the train left town. They raised money for bail and quickly brought their leaders home. By November 12th, all 27 were back in Tacoma, welcomed as heroes. A band played at the station. Celebrations followed. No one was ever punished. The very existence of these Chinese communities, despite their legal entry, despite their hard work, had been redefined as a problem to be solved. What began as immigration restriction had in practice become racial cleansing, even if the law never used those words. Seattle's version of what came to be known as the Tacoma Method was just as brutal, if not more so. 1,500 white residents rallied to force Chinese immigrants out of their city. Under armed guard at the foot of Main Street, 350 Chinese men, women, and children were gathered. These were people who had come to the US seeking a better life through hard work. Now they were prisoners, surrounded by a mob that was yelling, running, and shooting at their heels. From a downtown hotel room, the governor's wife watched the scene unfold, describing the Chinese detainees as trembling and crying. The only thing that eventually stopped the chaos was the governor's home guard firing into the crowd, wounding 5 rioters and finally dispersing the mob. But it was too late. As historian Erica Lee tells us, those who had not already been forced out by the mob left on their own in 1886. Just like in Tacoma, the Chinese community in Seattle had been wiped out. They were, in the chilling words often repeated at the time, no more. There was resistance. People protested. Legal challenges were mounted. Some immigrants tried to hide their identities. But the numbers were brutally lopsided. It was like trying to hold back a flood with your bare hands. As the federal deportation state grew, so did its power to detain, delay, and deny entry. Gradually, exceptions were written into the Exclusion Act. But these weren't open doors, they were loopholes, and getting through them was like winning the lottery. Lee explains that under the Exclusion Act, every Chinese passenger had to be individually inspected and approved for admission. Many were kept abroad at the steamships they arrived on for days or even weeks. When those ships had to return to Asia, the passengers were transferred to another boat in the harbor, still left waiting. This practice of floating detention lasted for nearly 20 years, leading immigration officials to complain about what they called a large floating Chinese alien population in the bay. To solve the quote-unquote problem, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company built a detention shed near its offices on Pier 40 in San Francisco. It was crude, overcrowded, unsanitary, and dangerous. Immigrants called it an iron cage or a Chinese jail. Even the inspectors admitted it was a fire trap and didn't offer basic security. Eventually, the government built Angel Island Immigration Station, the West Coast's answer to Ellis Island. But unlike the welcome imagery associated with its East Coast counterpart, Angel Island was a gatekeeper. From 1910 to 1940, more than 1 million people were processed through Angel Island. Of them, 178,000 were Chinese. To enter, they had to produce witnesses who could vouch that they wouldn't become a public charge. They endured humiliating and invasive medical exams, and they spent what little money they had on hiring specialized attorneys to navigate the maze of paperwork and interrogation. Then, in 1906, a twist of fate. An earthquake and fire destroyed San Francisco's City Hall, including all of its birth records. With no way to verify birthright citizenship, many Chinese immigrants seized the opportunity to claim they had been born in the United States. The result was the phenomenon known as paper sons, because at least on paper, each citizen suddenly had 3 or 4 more sons added to the family tree. To counter the rise of these paper sons, immigration authorities built what historian David Wyman later called a paper wall. A bureaucratic barrier of complex, deliberately confusing questions meant to trip up migrants and expose inconsistencies. Applicants were asked things like, where are your paternal grandparents buried? How many steps lead up to your home? Who lives in the 3rd row of your ancestral village? These weren't simple background checks. This was bureaucratic obstructionism, an intentional effort to use paperwork and red tape as tools of exclusion. Those who failed were detained at Angel Island. About 70% of all of those detainees were Chinese. Some were held for weeks, others for months, some for over a year. And during that time, many poured their grief, rage, and desperation into poetry, scratched into the wooden walls of the detention center. More than 200 poems survive today, written anonymously in nearly every corner of the men's barracks, now preserved as a national landmark. As Erica Lee writes, they bear witness to the trauma of xenophobia. One poem captures the heartbreak plainly. How was I to know that the Western barbarians had lost their hearts and reason? The Chinese Exclusion Act remained the law of the land for more than 60 years. What began in 1882 as a temporary 10-year ban was renewed again and again, first extended, then made permanent. It wasn't just a policy, it became a precedent. The first time the U.S. singled out a specific ethnic group for exclusion. And it opened the door for more. In 1924, the Immigration Act went even further. It banned virtually all immigration from Asia, not just China. Japan, Korea, India, the Philippines. The Asiatic Barred Zone, they called it. A wall drawn on a map. It wasn't until World War II that the exclusion laws finally began to collapse. And not because of some sudden realization that they were unjust. It was geopolitics. China became an ally in the fight against fascism. And the optics of banning your wartime partner's people from entering the country? Not great. But instead of disappearing, America's long history with anti-Asian hate merely transferred from the Chinese to the Japanese. So in 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed, but only partially. A token immigration quota of just 105 Chinese immigrants per year was set. That's right, 105 people. In a country of over 130 million at the time, we allowed a mere 105 individuals to come join our nation of immigrants. The full weight of exclusion laws didn't come down until 1965 with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which abolished national origin quotas. For the first time in nearly a century, Asian immigrants could come to the United States on equal footing. But of course, the story doesn't end there. The legacy of exclusion, of suspicion, scapegoating, and fear has proven incredibly durable. We saw it resurface in the 1980s when Vincent Chen, a Chinese-American man, was beaten to death in Detroit by auto workers who blamed Japanese imports for their economic struggles. He wasn't Japanese, but it didn't matter. And we saw it roar back in the 21st century. During the first Trump presidency, anti-Chinese rhetoric found new fuel. There were real geopolitical tensions, concerns about cybersecurity, espionage, and influence operations. Some were valid, some were exaggerated, but the consequences landed hardest on ordinary people. Politicians accused the Chinese government of buying up influence at American universities through the Confucian Institute program. My own hometown university came under fire for having such a partnership with Beijing, despite the university having less than 1% of its student body hailing from China. It was the beneficiary of a Confucian Institute. It sought to build connections between the East and West by reintroducing America to Chinese higher learning. I once attended a wedding at the beautiful facility. Having lived nearby for decades, I was shocked to find out that the Indiana Attorney General had identified the center as hostile propaganda to the United States. After a lawsuit was filed, the university quickly shuttered the institute, foregoing the millions of dollars that it had received during its decade-long partnership. The university claimed that the relationship was purely positive, but closed the institute for fear that its federal funding would be cut if it failed to comply. Still, proving that the past echoes to the present, government action sparked private hate, as the institute was vandalized after the announcement of a government investigation. Congressional hearings also probed the use of apps like TikTok, framing it as a Trojan horse for Chinese soft power. Its fate languished between the Trump terms, with Biden's administration following through on his predecessor's recommendation to force a sale from Beijing. Incredibly, however, Trump returned to office to save the popular social media platform, delaying the congressionally passed legislation which requires him to shut it down. But the biggest incident of anti-Chinese xenophobia came after Trump himself repeatedly referred to COVID-19 as the China virus and Kung Flu, language that quickly jumped from Twitter into everyday life. The words weren't just offensive, they were dangerous. According to a study by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, anti-Asian hate crimes in the U.S. surged by over 150% in 2020, with Chinese Americans bearing the brunt. Verbal harassment, physical assault, business vandalism, it all spiked. A Pew Research report found that 31% of Asian Americans feared being threatened or physically attacked simply because of their race. A 2020 statement from the Asian American Journalists Association called the phrase China virus both inaccurate and stigmatizing, warning that it endangers people and communities already vulnerable to hate. Whenever I have heard of the term, I have talked to students, friends, even family about the real-life consequences of using it. Almost universally, they shrug it off, claiming it's just a joke and that I shouldn't be so politically correct. But it's the through line to the past. From exclusion to expulsion, from paper walls to TikTok bans, from 1882 to 2020, there's a dangerous consistency to how America has treated its Chinese population, as well as Asian Americans as a whole. Avenue Q believes that we all laugh at ethnic jokes, but a benign joke hides its malice until it finds its way to a willing actor. What starts as foreign policy often becomes domestic prejudice. What begins as national security often ends in racial scapegoating. And when we let that happen, when we forget the humanity of those being targeted, the nativists win. So it's not enough to say the Chinese Exclusion Act is gone. Its shadow remains. Understanding that legacy is the first step to breaking it. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.